Elisabeth Fritzl lived in Amstetten, Austria, with her parents Joseph and Rosemarie, and several siblings. Unfortunately, her dad was really terrible to her. He's said to have started abusing her at 11 years old. From that point on, he'd force himself on her pretty much every night. Right around age 17, Elisabeth ran away from home and hid out with a friend in Vienna. After 3 weeks of living on the lam, Elisabeth was found by the police and brought back to her parents' home. Just 1 year later, Elisabeth disappeared again. Elisabeth had threatened to run away multiple times in the past, but this time seemed different. Although Elisabeth was 18 and technically an adult, her mom, Rosemarie, had a feeling that something bad happened. She rushed to file a missing persons report and a search began. Weeks passed and there was still no sign of Elisabeth. Her family grew more and more concerned. Where was she? And then about a month after the missing persons case was filed, the Fritzls received a letter. It was from Elisabeth. In the letter, Elisabeth told her family that she was staying with a friend because she was tired of them. She threatened to leave the country if they sent anyone to look for her. Joseph took this letter to the police and was all like, yeah, she's talked a lot about cults in the past, so maybe she joined one? The letter was in Elisabeth's handwriting. She had a reputation for running away and was a legal adult, so it all seemed to check out. With that, the case was pretty much closed, and everyone assumed Elisabeth had run away and joined a cult. I wish I could tell you that's what actually happened. 24 years later, we all found out that that whole story was a lie, and Elisabeth was being held captive in the Fritzls' bunker against her will. Here's how it happened. Since this story takes place in Austria during the Cold War, a lot of people built bunkers in their homes. The local council had actually granted Joseph permission and given him £2,000 to help with building expenses of the Fritzls' secret bunker, which he was currently working on in August of 1984, the same month Elisabeth disappeared. There were only 2 points of entry, both super heavy doors, one of which was reinforced with concrete and only able to open and close with a remote. To get into the bunker, you apparently had to open a series of 8 doors. On August 28th, Joseph asked Elisabeth to come downstairs and help him with lifting one of the doors onto its frame. Elisabeth agreed and followed her dad downstairs to help him out. When she got down there, she held the door up while Joseph secured the hinges. Suddenly, he shoved a piece of cloth soaked in ether over her mouth and nose, causing her to pass out. He forced her into the bunker and closed the door. Even though her dad had harmed her in the past, Elisabeth had no idea he was going to lock her in the bunker. And for 24 years, no one could have predicted that. At first, Elisabeth's arms were strapped and tied behind her back with a chain that was then connected to the metal posts of a bed. She was barely able to move. Over the next few days, Joseph lightened up a bit and tied the chain around her waist instead of her arms. And he later got rid of the chain entirely because it was hard for him to force himself on her. Yeah, I'm sure you guessed it, but Joseph would repeatedly torture, abuse, and physically violate Elisabeth, his daughter. Joseph had been planning this for years. He never intended to build this bunker for his family's safety. He'd always planned to use it as a dungeon to lock his daughter in and do terrible things to her. The living circumstances were just awful too. The cellar had dirt walls and no natural light. It got extremely hot in the summers, like sauna hot, and in the winters, it was cold and damp. Elisabeth sometimes had to soak up water that ran down the walls with towels. She also had to catch rats with her bare hands. Joseph would visit her pretty much daily and bring her supplies and food. Elisabeth had absolutely no sense of time, and this bunker was so secure, the chances of her being discovered were microscopic. From the many times her father forced himself on her, which is estimated to be around 3,000, Elisabeth became pregnant, not once, not twice, 8 times. Her first pregnancy happened about 2 years into captivity. After carrying the baby for 10 weeks, Elisabeth suffered a miscarriage. I cannot begin to imagine the many emotions Elisabeth experienced. To go through years of abuse at the hands of her father, be thrown in a cellar, get pregnant, and now lose a child? That's a lot. 2 years after the miscarriage, Elisabeth got pregnant again. She gave birth in August of 1988 and named her firstborn Kirsten. And 2 years after that, she had another child, a son named Stefan. Elisabeth did her best to take care of her kids, and she tried to teach them the things she learned when she was in school. To give you a sense of timing, all of Elisabeth's births happened over 12 years. She performed all of the births without any medical help, just some disinfectant, dirty scissors, and a book on childbirth that Joseph gave to her. One of her babies was born with breathing issues. He passed away in Elisabeth's arms at a day and a half old. The other 4 babies survived. However, not all of them were allowed to live with Elisabeth and the other 2 kids. She was only able to keep 1 more child with her. Joseph snuck the other 3 kids out of the bunker and left them outside, either on the doorstep or in the bushes. All 3 babies were left with a note written by Elisabeth that said something along the lines of, "I had this baby and can't take care of it. I'm leaving it with you to raise." All 3 babies were discovered by the Fritzls and brought into their home. And the circumstances worked in Joseph's favor, unfortunately. Since Elisabeth had already run away in the past and he got her to write that letter, everyone assumed that she'd run away and joined a cult. They thought she was in a cult, so in that scenario, who knows what this cult's baby policy was. As for Joseph, his family never thought twice about his frequent trips to the bunker. Every morning at 9 a.m., Joseph would go down to the bunker to work on plans for machines he sold. Sometimes he'd sleep down there because he was working so hard. Rosemary was proud of her husband for being so hardworking and career-oriented. Little did she know. As much trauma as having those kids must have been for Elisabeth, given the circumstances, they provided her a will to live and some comfort. She was no longer completely alone down there. The 3 kids that stayed in the bunker with Elisabeth sadly witnessed a lot of Joseph's abuse, but Elisabeth did her best to protect them. In a way, Elisabeth was happy her 3 other children were able to lead a more normal life upstairs. But she was definitely sad about being separated from them, never knowing if they'd all be reunited again. Honestly, Joseph seemed to have no plan to ever let Elisabeth or their 3 kids out of the bunker. Anyway, one day in 2008, the oldest child, Kirsten, got super sick. At this point, she was 19 years old. Elisabeth begged Joseph to let Kirsten go to the hospital because she didn't know if she'd make it. Reluctantly, Joseph agreed. He snuck Kirsten out of the bunker, which was the first time she'd ever been outside in her life. Joseph put Kirsten in his Mercedes and drove to the hospital. He made Elisabeth stay back. At the hospital, doctors were very concerned about Kirsten's appearance. Remember, she had never seen the light of day, gone to the doctor, or eaten well, and it showed. Her skin was really pale, her teeth were in horrible condition, and she was suffering from kidney failure. Not the typical traits of a 19-year-old. With alarms going off in their heads, these doctors later reported the incident to the police. At the time, Joseph wasn't telling anyone Kirsten was his daughter. He came to the hospital with a note that he claimed was from Kirsten's mom, explaining her state. Kirsten was interviewed by the police, but she didn't give them any information about her family or upbringing. Elisabeth pleaded with Joseph to let her out of the bunker so she could go to the hospital to be with Kirsten. Meanwhile, the police grew more and more suspicious of Joseph, so much so that they reopened the case of Elisabeth's disappearance. Well, on April 26, 2008, Joseph released Elisabeth from the bunker. This was the first time she'd been outside in 24 years. Now, it's not exactly clear as to why Joseph let her out, but most reports say he was getting old and weak, and his plan to hold her captive wasn't as solid anymore. Again, no one knew how long he planned to keep her in there, but it's crazy that it went on this long. Some reports say Joseph had devised a plan of sorts to cover his tracks. My guess is he released Elisabeth and told her to go to the hospital and recite a speech that would clear his name. I'm not sure. The bottom line is Elisabeth was released. She went to the hospital and immediately turned heads. If you thought Kirsten looked bad after 19 years in the cellar, think of what 24 years and 8 pregnancies looked like. No shade to Elisabeth at all. I'm just trying to clarify why so many people were worried about her. Doctors notified the police about Elisabeth's arrival, and she was brought into a separate room for questioning. The authorities began asking Elisabeth intense questions, threatening her with charges of child abuse. Elisabeth broke down and said she'd tell the police everything if they could promise her that she'd never have to see her dad again. They agreed, and Elisabeth went into detail about her 24 gruesome years in the bunker. Shocked, disgusted, and appalled, the detectives documented everything Elisabeth said and arrested Joseph that night. I'm sure they felt extremely guilty for not taking her missing persons case more seriously all those years ago. All of the kids were set free from the bunker and subjected to a DNA test that confirmed Joseph was their father. At the trial, Joseph's lawyer tried his hardest to paint his client as a caring person to Elisabeth and their children. The lawyer was all like, Joseph brought a Christmas tree down to the bunker during the holidays. He also brought them books and a bird. He's so nice. Joseph claimed he decided to put Elisabeth in the bunker because she was a stubborn teen and he just wanted to protect her from bad people, substances, and alcohol, and instead subject her to physical violence, unsupervised childbirth, and no daylight? Nope, you're incorrect, sir. Thankfully, nobody was buying any of this BS. The evidence was loud and clear. The facts were there, and there's no denying that Joseph was a sick man who should have never done this. In the end, he was found guilty of detention of persons, coercion, mass rape, incest, and murder. Remember the baby Elisabeth had that passed away shortly after birth? Joseph admitted to putting the baby's body in an incinerator, so that's where the murder charge comes from. As for Elisabeth, she was immediately sent to a facility for therapy. The 3 kids that were in the bunker reportedly had a really hard time adjusting to life in the real world, suffering panic attacks, extreme anxiety, and one of them couldn't even walk right because he'd spent so much time crouched down in the cellar. The 3 kids who lived with Rosemary also have struggled on their own. They have and are still probably working through a lot of anger and resentment from learning the truth about their conception, their father, and all that comes with this case. It's so sad to think about all the physical, mental, and emotional damage suffered by Elisabeth and her children. It's great they survived, but to go through 24 years of complete and utter agony takes a special person. Anyway, that's today's episode. Thanks for sticking it out with me. See you next time on Killer Bites.